What I want to do now, we are going to jump into the criticism of the philosophic case for the pro-life view. But before we do that, I want to give you where we ground our case. The pro-life view is grounded in a view of human persons known as the substance view of human persons. Let me define what a substance is. A substance is distinguished from a property thing. You have substance and you have property things. Substances are living organisms that maintain their identity through time and change. In other words, if you lose an arm, are you still you? Yeah, you are. In fact, any physical change to your body that doesn't kill you, you retain your identity through that change. If you lop a branch off your tree, is it still a tree? Yeah, it's still a tree. If a dog loses a leg, it's still a dog. And why is it still a dog? Because the dog has an inner nature that sets its parameters, determines its growth trajectory, and determines the kind of thing it is. And human beings are the same kind of thing. We have a human nature that determines how we grow, how we develop, what our ultimate capacities will be, and we retain our identity through time and change. For example, the cells in your body have gone through massive changes over the course of the years you've been alive. A lot of them have been completely replaced. In what sense, then, are you the same person? Well, it can't be that it's just something physical, because if that were the case, every time your physical parts changed, who else would change? You would. You'd be a different person, right? What is it that unifies us through time and change? It's our human nature, that immaterial essence that we have that grounds our identity through time and change. Human beings, according to the substance view, are valuable in virtue of the kind of thing we are. Meaning that if we are valuable today, we were what back then? Valuable, because we're identical to our former embryonic selves. We've had changes in our functional abilities. We have changed in our talents, our appearance, our skills, but the kind of thing we are has never changed. We are the same being now as we were then. Now contrast that with my automobile. My automobile, if I change the motor and tires, do I technically have the same car? Not really. I've changed the parts, right? The car does not have a unifying nature that holds it together through time and change. Greg Kokel uses a good example. He says, imagine if I replace plank by plank every piece of wood on my deck. Do I still have the same deck when I'm all done? Well, not really. The parts have changed. Still looks like a deck, but really it's different. If I take my '69 Ford Mustang that I wish I still had, before I sold that thing, may God forgive me, and I replace the motor, and I replace the transmission, and I soup up the suspension, well, you know, I've got a different car, I really do. My son, who's 19, decided last week he had to go put Flowmaster dual exhaust on his 2002 Mustang and put one of those speaker systems in the trunk, those big, huge things that sounds like an earthquake a mile away. I don't understand kids. But anyway, he changed some things in his car. And it cost him more than he was anticipating, I'll tell you. What a awakening that was. But he doesn't have technically the same car he did. That's the difference between a property thing that has parts and a human being that is a substance thing that has a nature that unifies it through time and change. Now, why does this matter? Why am I even bringing up this whole substance thing, property thing? Here's why. The substance view says that you are identical to your former embryonic self. You're the same being through all of the changes since your beginning, which means that if you are intrinsically valuable now, you were intrinsically valuable back then. That's the substance view, and it helps explain things. For example, to borrow an illustration from Frank Beckwith, suppose you have a favorite uncle we'll call Uncle Jed. And Uncle Jed is in a terrible accident, goes into a coma, loses consciousness, loses the ability to function with self-awareness, Is he the same person while he's in that coma that he was before? He was. Would it be wrong to kill him in that position? Well, it would. Now let's say he wakes up, but he has none of the memories of his past life. He's starting all over. Touches the hot stove, burns himself. Wasn't there a movie regarding Henry Harrison Ford, something like that? Yeah, that kind of thing. Is he the same person as he was before the accident? And is he the same person as he was while in the coma? Yes. So what is it that unifies him? It can't be self-awareness. Why? Because he lost it, right? And then regained it. So something else grounds his identity through time and change. The substance view says what grounds his identity is his inner nature that remains the same. If we don't have that inner nature, then I don't know how you account for someone losing functional ability and regaining it and saying they retain their identity. It's like changing parts on a car, if that's all we are part things. So that's the substance view. Now, some challenges that come to that view. The first is that the embryo is not self-aware. Now, just a little warning here. We're starting to get into the graduated, accelerated, advanced apologetics part of this. I want to help you out here. If you start to get discouraged that you're not following me, it's in the notes, and I do explain it fully. So in the interest of time, I will go through it quickly. You can always stop me if you want clarification, but don't think, oh boy, I'm losing it, I'm dumb, I can't keep up with this. No, it's new material, don't sweat it. It's in the notes. It's okay. I was where you were at one point, listening to J.P. Moreland explain this to me, thinking I am the world's biggest nerd. And thankfully, J.P. was very patient and coached me through, and I began to get this. So I understand if this is new to you, don't panic, it's okay. First objection to the substance view of human persons is that embryos are not self-aware. What's doing the work in this view, according to this view, is that you have self-awareness. Marianne Warren would be someone who believes this. She argued that for a human being to be a person with a right to life, they have to be a person. That there's a difference between being human and being a person. This view is not new. John Locke believed that we needed to divide between man and rational person. And you will find that when you read your Sutton book, that's one of the reading books that you have, the book by Agneta Sutton on Christian bioethics, she does a very nice job of tracing this history of dualistic thought that says you can have a human being here and a person over here. And really that what matters is the rational, self-aware person. That's what really matters, not that you're a being of a particular kind. Marianne Warren says that for a human being to be a person and hence have a right to life, they have to be self-aware, they have to be able to react with their environment, they have to be able to have some sense of continuance over time. Now, she doesn't say you have to have all these things, but you got to have at least a few of them or you don't count. Another person who argues this way is Paul Simmons. Paul Simmons argues theologically, believe it or not. He says human beings bear the image of God, but only if they're persons. Only if they're able to function with a sense of moral awareness. Only if they are able to act in community. All right? So what gives us value, according to this view, is not the kind of thing we are by nature. Rather, it's the functional ability we have to immediately exercise an accidental thing like self-awareness. Now, the substance view comes along and says, wait a minute, I can lose self-awareness and still be me. So how does this work? And what we end up getting is people who have a difficult time explaining why humans have value in the first place. So let me just throw this out to you. What right away strikes you as a problem with a view that says the embryo is not self-aware, therefore it doesn't have a right to life? Let's just start with picking out some things that are good problems with that view.
Well, if you're in a deep sleep, then we could kill you. You got no value.
How about when I'm in a coma, a reversible coma, or a deep sleep? Yeah. Don't bunk out at Marianne Warren's house tonight. Yeah, exactly. What else?
How do you measure self-awareness?
How do you measure it? Like, okay, how much of it do I have to count?
How can you tell that there's none in an embryo?
I would say we can pretty well determine there's not self-awareness even after birth, which raises one of the big problems with this view. Who else is disqualified? Newborns. Newborns are not self-aware. In other words, seeing themselves exist over time and as separate entities to their mothers. The best research to date indicates that doesn't happen until several weeks after birth. And that's exactly Peter Singer's point in this book. Singer, though his conclusions appall us, is brutally consistent. And I appreciate that. Singer says, hey, all you abortion rights advocates out there who think you can draw this magical line at birth and say kill the fetus before birth, no problem, but you can't do it after? Fetus isn't self-aware, newborn isn't self-aware, you can kill both. Now, he's being consistent. He at least is pushing the argument where it goes. If self-awareness makes us valuable, newborns fail to qualify. What else? What other things can we point out about this view?
Handicapped folks that have some.
Mentally disabled folks? Sure. Yeah.
You could probably argue that animals like chimps could be self-aware, and so which one is really a person? Like, the lines just become so blurred that it just becomes ridiculous.
Precisely. That's exactly what Singer says. Singer says many animals are more self-aware than many infants. Therefore, who's the real person? The self-aware chimp or the newborn? Singer's going to say you have a greater duty to the ape than you do the newborn. Because Singer will go on to argue that mere membership in the human species doesn't mean a hill of beans. What matters is whether you're a person, and persons are self-conscious beings who can experience pleasure and pain. And infants do not experience self-awareness the way other living things do, so the animals have a greater push.
So if his mother was in the latter stages of Alzheimer's or dementia, what would he say about her?
If Peter Singer's mother were suffering from Alzheimer's, which, by the way, she was. She died of that about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and he actually was a model son, took care of her till the end, provided for her, but you raise a very good point. If the loss of self-awareness disqualifies us, in what sense was he treating a person at that point? And I think according to the logical flow of his own argument, he'd have to say she wasn't a person and didn't have a right to anything, what would be. There's something else here, though, I want you to see as well. When Marianne Warren says self-awareness is what gives us value, guess what she doesn't do anywhere in her essay? She never tells us why self-awareness is decisive in the first place. Can I give you a little tip here? The first thing that ought to come out of your mouth when you hear somebody give you a reason why the unborn don't count as full human beings, ask why that property they're putting forward as decisive is value-giving in the first place. They need to argue for that. It's not enough to just assert it. Okay, fine. Marianne Warren comes along and says self-awareness is what gives us value. I say it's having a belly button that points out rather than in. So there. Now, why is her category any less arbitrary and ad hoc than mine? She's got to argue for it. She's got to make a case for why that's decisive. She doesn't do it. Other things you see with this problem, or problems with this self-awareness argument. What about this? Do embryos have a capacity for self-awareness? They do, in virtue of what? The kind of thing they are. The embryo has a basic capacity for self-awareness. What does the embryo lack? Maturity, or an immediately exercisable capacity for self-awareness. In other words, it has a basic capacity, but not one that can be immediately brought into play. On what grounds does Marianne Warren say that what gives us a right to life is the immediate capacity and not the basic one. Does she ever argue for that? No, she doesn't. She just asserts it. But it seems to make more sense that it's what we are by nature that matters, our natural capacities rather than our immediate ones, that ought to carry the ground, that ought to be the thing that determine who counts as a human being rather than what we can do at this exact moment. And the Uncle Jed example we just did a moment ago is a classic case of that. Here's another example. Well, no, I'm going to save that one for later. So embryos have this in virtue of what they are. The next thing you'll hear, and then we're going to take a stand-up break, our last one of the night, you'll hear that embryos are equivalent to brain-dead people. And John Hood makes this argument. John Hood says, look, if the end of life is the cessation of brain function, shouldn't the beginning of valuable human life be the beginning of brain function? In other words, he's trying to make this symmetrical argument. Already we've talked about why those two aren't parallel. What's the first thing we would point out?
Irreversible.
Yeah, there's a real difference between the brain-dead person who's in the category of no more, as Stephen Schwartz points out, and the embryo that's in the category of not yet. The embryo doesn't yet need a brain to live. The brain-dead person has suffered an irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain. He's gone. He's dead. Is the embryo in a position of having suffered an irreversible loss of all? No, not at all. It just yet isn't functioning with a brain. It doesn't need it, though. Something else coordinates its bodily system so that it can live. So that's a big difference right there. The last thing we'll do before we get to our break, everybody doing okay, by the way? Staying awake? You're a remarkably patient bunch. I'm on East Coast time. I can pump myself full of caffeine and go till 4 in the morning and be just fine. Be dead tomorrow morning, but Scott Rae's speaking first, so I'll be fine. You'll get people who come along and say you have to have a desire for a right to life, otherwise you're not harmed if we abort you or kill you. And because fetuses lack brain development to have a desire to live, we really aren't doing anything wrong if we kill them through elective abortion or embryonic stem cell research or whatever, because they don't have a conscious desire to live anyway. And it's the desire that gives you a right to life, and until you have an immediate access to desire, well, we really aren't harming you if we kill you. Question, can I be harmed without being aware that I've been hurt? Can you give me an example?
What is that, a stroke or something of that nature that their brain is still functioning? They might not necessarily feel the pain of someone in a coma.
Okay.
They're still hurt.
Yeah. If you slit my throat when I'm sleeping at night, I may not feel it, but I've still been harmed. Yeah. How about desires, though? Could I be... Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say in terms of desires, it's interesting because if somebody is suicidal, they don't have a desire to live. So does that justify me killing that person or that person just going ahead and committing suicide?
Yeah, what about that? What would be wrong with suicide in that case? Now, David Boonen's going to give us an answer, but just on the surface, I agree with you. That's a problem right there. How about if I never know that I've been cheated out of $1 million inheritance? Therefore, I don't desire the inheritance. But I got cheated out of it. Have I still been wronged? Yeah, absolutely. How about a child that doesn't know it's entitled to proper nutrition and education, and therefore someone says, well, I'm not going to bother to educate the kid or worry about feeding him anything but Twinkies? Is that child still being harmed even though it may not desire good nutrition and education? Yeah. So you have a real problem there with grounding rights in desires. But now is going to come along a fellow by the name of David Boonen who's going to clear all this up for us. Lest I sound too cynical, David Boonen has written what I happen to believe is the best defense of the abortion choice position that's out there. I don't think it succeeds. But David Boonen, in his book, A Defense of Abortion, argues two things, the first of which we'll take up now and the second we'll take up tomorrow. The first thing he takes up is that rights depend on having a conscious desire for something, And the fetus, because it lacks organized cortical brain activity, does not yet have the physical structures in place to desire anything. Therefore, it lacks a conscious desire for life. Therefore, it can be killed. Now, right away, you're thinking, wait a minute, newborns don't have a conscious desire to go on living, so Boonen's saying we can kill newborns. No, Boonen's going to make a distinction. Here's what I want you to see. I'm going to attempt to explain this to you, and I have studied this, and I still have my head swimming when I try to go through this. And it shows how the view lacks explanatory power, in my view. You won't believe what he's got to work to do. And wait till you hear his defense of bodily rights tomorrow. But here's what Boonen says. The newborn cannot be killed even though it lacks a conscious desire. And Boonen goes on to say we need to distinguish between occurrent desires, those desires that we have and are immediately aware of, such as your immediate desire right now that I would shut up so we can go on break. Okay? You have an occurrent desire. But you also have, says Boonen, what are known as dispositional desires. Dispositional desires are those desires you have that you're not consciously thinking of, but you nonetheless have them. For example, a desire not to die early from cancer, to live long, a desire to have a happy marriage, a desire that your children grow up a certain way. You may not immediately be thinking of them, but you still have them even though they're not in your immediate awareness. Everybody clear on that distinction? Boonen then goes on to say that the right to life is grounded in our dispositional desires. So even though the newborn may not have an occurrent, immediate desire to go on living, it still has a dispositional desire that we can ground in its cortical brain development. It has the sufficient brain structures in place to have that desire. Dispositional desires ground a right to life, not your immediate ones. And that way he can say, see, I can disqualify the fetus, but I don't have to do like Singer does and turn right around and disqualify the newborn. Now, you made a point about what about the suicidal person who doesn't, was it you? Yeah, that wanted to kill himself. Here, Boonen makes another distinction. Sorry for all these distinctions, but here we go. Now Boonen's going to distinguish between actual desires and ideal desires. For example, can I borrow that bottle of water that's sitting on your desk? You are a very thirsty man. You have been working out in the yard, and it's been a 100-degree day, and you have done yeoman's work replanting the garden. You see this bottle of cool water sitting on the counter. You have an actual desire for that bottle of water. It's cold. You're just waiting to chug it down. What you don't know is it's laced with cyanide. Now, you have an actual desire to drink it, but Boonen would say, wait a minute, what trumps your actual desire at that point is your ideal desire. Your ideal desire is not to die from drinking that. Even though you're not consciously aware of the problem, you still have an ideal desire not to be harmed by the water. Everybody following where we're going with this? I'll give this back to you before I drink from it, because I have an actual desire. So what does this all mean? Boonen says newborns have dispositional desires to live even though they're not consciously aware of it because of the nature of their brain development. They also have ideal desires to live, and because they at least have those two things, we ought not destroy the newborn where we can destroy the fetus. Okay? That's the basic argument that Boonen's going to put forward. So what I want to ask you as we go to break here, what are we going to say to Boonen?
How does he know that the newborn has all these desires, but before it's born, it doesn't have any of those desires?
So we could question how he knows they have this. Now, keep in mind, he's not saying they actually have these desires. He said we should attribute them those desires the way we attribute to him the desire not to drink that, even though he wants it at that moment. So we attribute these desires.
Why shouldn't we attribute those desires to the baby before it's born?
Boonen's answer would be the reason we don't attribute it to the fetus is because it lacks cortical brain organization that would allow it to have any kind of desire. Yeah, that's exactly what you should be doing, huh? Yeah.
But it will, well, at what point during the before it's born, is he trying to say the brain won't be functioning that way until after the baby is born?
28 to 32 weeks, he says, is when cortical brain activity kicks in. All right, what's the first, go ahead.
28 to 30 weeks after it's
No, 28 to 32 weeks in the womb. Yeah, in the pregnancy. 28 to 32 weeks in the pregnancy. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. What's the first question we should ask Boonin at this point? Why is that value giving? Exactly right. Do you think he gives an answer? Nope. Nope. Doesn't do it. Doesn't do it at all. So let's use a little bit modified Uncle Jed example here. Uncle Jed is in a terrible accident. He goes into a coma, and while he's in the coma, the doctor appears to the family and says, here's what's true of Uncle Jed. His injuries are such that he has lost all of his memories of his past life. He has forever lost his conscious connection to his past life. He will come out of the coma in 9 months, but will have no conscious connection to his previous life or desires or awareness. In that exact moment in the coma, isn't Uncle Jed essentially in the same position as the standard preconscious fetus? Now, do you think Boonin would say we can kill Uncle Jed at that point? Actually, he would say no. And my question is, why not? It seems to me Uncle Jed lacks both occurrent and dispositional desires at that point. So what grounds Uncle Jed's right to life? I think Boonin would say, and Beckwith agrees with this, I should say I agree with Beckwith since he is the one bringing this up. Beckwith would say that Boonin would argue that even though Uncle Jed has to relearn everything again and has no connection with his past, he still shouldn't be killed as a human being. Uh-oh, what's doing the work then at that point? Desires or something else? His nature as a human being. The argument seems to be at that point that the reason we shouldn't kill Uncle Jed is he has a particular nature. Well, if that's true, who else has that same nature? The fetus. Go to break. I'll see you in 5 minutes. One point I want to get back to just in general about self-awareness grounding a right to life. If an accidental property, meaning a property you could lose or gain without changing your essential nature, if something accidental like self-awareness is what gives you a right to life, how do you account for human equality? Let's look around the room right now. Some of you are on the upside of a caffeine fix. You went down to the Starbucks on campus or whatever that place is. Seattle's Best, is it? Is that what it is? Okay, whatever. You got your caffeine fix and you're good. We could go to 11:30, 12 and you'd be fine. Others of you, you had that big gulp at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you're on the backside of that caffeine drop. Okay? If self-awareness is what gives us value, wouldn't those who have more of it have greater rights than those who have less? Meaning you can take the concept of human equality and throw it on the ash heap of history. Pick any accidental property you want, viability, the experience of pain, pleasure. Whoever has more of it has a greater right to life, right? It just follows. A far better way to argue is to say that we all share something in common equally. What is it? What is the one thing we share in common equally? We all have the same human nature. And by the way, you don't have a human nature in degrees. You either have it or you don't. You do have, by degree, levels of self-awareness, the ability to feel pain. But you do not have, by degrees, a human nature. You either got one or you don't. And that's the only way to account for human equality objectively without getting into very subjective, ad hoc, and arbitrary standards that determine who counts and who doesn't. We're equal by nature, not function, as James would tell us. Not James, the biblical writer, but the philosopher. Okay. Next thing we want to do here is wrap up Boonin in this whole problem with desires. What happens if I have a bunch of slaves that I have conditioned to never desire their freedom? Are they entitled to their freedom even though they don't desire it? Okay, I would say yes. Even though they've been indoctrinated to believe that they do not deserve freedom or even desire it. It doesn't mean that they are therefore not entitled to it. There was a stunning survey in 2004 of Turkish women. A third of them felt that it was their husband's right to beat them if they withheld sex, burned the dinner, or somehow made a mistake disciplining the children. Now, even though these women were conditioned to believe that they could be beaten and it would be justified, did that mean they were, or that it was justified to beat them, even though they didn't desire not to be beaten, we might say? No, of course not. So the fact that someone doesn't desire something doesn't mean we can withhold from them what they are deservedly entitled to by nature of the kind of thing they are. And what's doing the work, or ought to do the work, is the nature of the being, not whether it has desires that are immediately exercisable in this case. Here's another example Beckwith uses to show where this whole desire paradigm falls apart. Boonin, you'll remember, argues that having a cortical or organized cortical brain activity is what gives us the ability to have self-consciousness where we can experience desires. Suppose one of these slaves that we just mentioned, says Beckwith, has a child in the womb, and the slave owner contracts with an entrepreneurial enterprising science guy, who performs a surgery on the fetus so that it never develops organized cortical brain activity, and therefore never desires freedom, or anything really. Would Boonin say that was wrong? I mean, what would be wrong about it? Was the child harmed? Well, we would say so, but how would Boonin say so? The child's brain was altered before it reached organized cortical brain activity. Okay? So it doesn't desire anything, and the surgery was done before you had organized cortical brain activity. So would Boonin say that was wrong? What do you think? I think he'd have to say no, but I'll bet you he wants to say yes. But what would be his argument? Wouldn't he probably have to say something like, well, that's wrong because that entity deserves something else? Well, wait a minute now, what are we talking about at this point? Nature is doing the work, not desire. And that is, I think, what we need to look at. Here's another example. Now I'll save that for Pinker. All right, any questions on Boonin regarding organized brain activity? All right, let's jump to one of my favorite people, Mr. Steven Pinker. MIT philosopher, defender of infanticide, wrote an article several years ago that put his name on the map, arguing about the reasons women might kill their newborns. And not that he came out and said you ought to do that, but basically said, you know, it's not entirely irrational that some women would do this. And certainly opened some questions. Steven Pinker argues the following. The substance view of human persons that we just talked about, that humans are valuable in virtue of the kind of thing they are, and the kind of thing they are stays the same through change and time. Pinker says that view of human dignity is stupid, useless, probably dangerous, and needs to be replaced with an entirely secular bioethic that does not ask any metaphysical questions about the nature of human beings. Pinker says we need to get rid of metaphysical considerations when we do bioethics. Don't worry about the nature of the beings in question. Instead, we can focus and base bioethics on two principles: consent and personal autonomy. We don't need dignity. Personal autonomy and consent will do all the hard work for us. In a moment, I'll tell you why that's not going to work, but I want to focus in on something more fundamental at this point. Pinker then goes on to say that we ought to embrace in bioethics what is known as scientific materialism. What is scientific materialism? A metaphysical worldview that says what? All truth, reality is reduced to physical processes, right? Immaterial things like souls, morality, they're not real items of knowledge. You have conditioned physical responses, you have physical things, but you can't bring into this immaterial things like human dignity. But scientific materialism, as Megan pointed out, is not neutral when it comes to metaphysics. It's a worldview about the nature of reality, our place in the universe, and how we ought to view things. So on one hand, he gets on our case for doing metaphysics, but of course, he jumps right in there and brings in his own. He's not neutral in the least, to put it mildly. Let's talk, though, about why he thinks human dignity is useless. He says it's useless, and here's his main argument. Human dignity is subjective because cultures disagree on what it means. Now, those of you that have listened to Greg Kokel and Frank Beckwith's teaching on relativism, you right away are going, wait a minute, that's called society does relativism, the belief that because cultures disagree, nobody's right. But wait a minute, how does it follow that because people don't agree on human dignity, that the concept itself is vacuous? Obviously, people disagree with Pinker, don't they? Which would mean what about his own view?
Can't believe it.
Can't believe it because people disagree with it. If disagreement means there's no truth, his own view falls apart. His own view of human dignity is thereby defeated, and he's got a problem. I think he's also got a problem with autonomy and consent. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to blitz through this, and you can stop me if you want. Let's ask if autonomy alone can do the work we need to have in bioethics. In other words, personal freedom and autonomy. Let's say in the next room, we have 100 men, age 30, who determine that what they want to do in life is live an autonomous life where they are going to eat as much trans fat as they can, and their purpose and goal is to die of strokes, every one of them by age 35. And let's say 3 years out, after eating enormous quantities of trans fatty foods, these men start dying. And as men start dying, the remaining survivors triple the amount of trans fatty food they're eating to expedite their own dying processes. Would Steven Pinker, do you think, say that those men were wasting their lives and not living up to their potential? Do you think he would? I think his intuitions would scream at him, what they're doing is wrong. But if that's true, is autonomy alone a good enough foundation for doing bioethics? Those men are acting autonomously. So who are we to judge? Greg Kokel once mentioned this group. I remember this. I had just joined Stand to Reason back in 1997. And there was this cult group called the Hale-Bopp Comet Group. Do you remember them? They were waiting for some comet, and they all committed mass suicide. And all over the news is, what a tragedy, what a horrible tragedy. And I remember Greg at a staff meeting saying, why was it a tragedy? These people fulfilled their wish. They had an autonomous desire to commit suicide. If autonomy is all we need, we don't need dignity, then who are we to say these people didn't fulfill their natures They're autonomous. What about consent? You always hear consent alone is enough to determine right and wrong. I can think of all kinds of problems with consent being the issue. Can you think of any?
There was the case, I think, in Germany of the man looking for someone to cannibalize, and
Yes.
the person actually consented to it.
There was a man in Germany, precisely correct, who put out an ad saying that he wanted to eat someone alive. And he found someone who agreed to it, consented to it. And that's what the plan was. Now, if consent does all the work, then what's the problem here? How about this? If the Jews had consented to the Holocaust, would that have made it right? So I think we can see that there's issues with Pinker trying to throw out human dignity and substitute consent and autonomy. Runs us into all kinds of problem, including the Turkish women we talked about just a few moments ago. Go ahead.
Don't consent and personal autonomy, don't those presuppose human dignity at some level? I mean, why would you need a human's consent? Why would it be important for a human to determine their own course unless there's something valuable about them and being able to do that?
Yeah, and why do we require consent if humans have no intrinsic nature that's valuable to where we would ask for it? I agree. Now, as Christians, we would not argue that consent and autonomy mean nothing.
Yeah.
We just don't believe they're ultimate.
Yeah.
Do we believe in consent? Of course we do. Can a physician perform an unwarranted surgery on you that you have not consented to? Of course not. That we would say that's wrong. We also think you have autonomy. If you choose to not have a certain treatment, you have that right to refuse it. But we don't think autonomy and consent are the foundation for bioethics. They are considerations, but they are not the foundation. There are other moral factors that come into play. Pinker's going to say, no, forget all the other metaphysics. Let's just go with consent and autonomy. Well, we see where that leads us. All right, we're going to wrap up tonight with Peter Singer, and then very quickly talking about what about those who throw the religion objection at us, and then we're done. And we will get out 10 minutes early. For those of you that want to stay here till 2 in the morning, my Diet Coke is still going, so we're good. Here is Peter Singer, the guy who argues that we can kill newborns. Very briefly, Peter Singer helps pro-lifers out at an intuition level, because people hear him and go, yuck. Kill newborns up to 30 days? Huh? They go, yuck. But Singer is brutally consistent, though he arrives at the wrong conclusions. But he gets to the right point of saying there's no essential difference between newborn and fetus that would justify saving one and not the other. For that, I give him credit. But Singer is going to go on to argue throughout his book, Practical Ethics, and other places, that what matters is having an immediate capacity for pleasure or pain. All animals are equal in their ability for pain and pleasure is going to be one of the foundational pillars of his view. And we cannot set the human animal apart from other animals and say humans have a right to certain dignity that others don't simply because they're members of the human species. He calls that speciesism, where you elevate your own species above other living creatures the way that some people elevate their own race above other races and thus are guilty of racism. In Singer's mind, speciesism and racism are one and the same. They're cut of the same cloth. He goes on to argue, as was mentioned earlier, that there are certain animals who are self-aware and therefore are persons, and there's certain humans who lack self-awareness of seeing themselves exist over time and having an ability to experience pleasure and pain. Therefore, the animals are the true persons and the human may not be. Membership in the human community does not confer personhood. What confers personhood, and that's what matters, is the capacity for pleasure and pain that you have because you're a self-conscious being. Everybody with me on Singer so far? And as a result of that, Singer says, yeah, you can kill the newborn. You can kill the newborn because it's not yet a person. I will argue that Peter Singer's view has savage inequality for both animals and humans. Because in Singer's view, it's your capacity for self-consciousness, seeing yourself exist over time, capacity for pleasure and pain. If you have more of that than some other animal, what do you have? More value. That means animals that have greater amounts of that than other animals have greater rights, right? And Singer can't account for that. He says all animals are equal in their ability to feel pain and pleasure, but they're really not, are they? And that would mean then that there really isn't an equal standard there. We've got inequality. But here's something else that I believe it was J.P. Moreland who said this. I don't know for sure, but it's been a while. Let's assume it is J.P., and if this is a bad argument, it wasn't J.P., okay? But I think it was. Can Singer himself escape the charge of speciesism? Let's toss that around for a moment. Can he? And if not, why not? What does Singer say is decisive? Rationality, self-consciousness. What are those typically traits of? Humans. So what is he judging the animals by? Human standards. How come having alligator traits isn't what gives us value? Tough skin and powerful jaws. You see, he's judging the animals by what kind of standard? A characteristically human standard, which means he's guilty of speciesism. Does that make sense? I think that was J.P. who said this, because I think it's a brilliant observation, and I know I didn't come up with it. So I'm going to say it was J.P. But that's exactly right. Think of the counterintuitive examples, though, that come from Singer's view. You have, as Robert George and Patrick Lee point out, a juvenile rat over here with a tremendous toothache. And you have a 3-year-old boy over here who also has a toothache, but it's not quite as bad as the one the rat is experiencing. Under Singer's view, who gets priority treatment? The rat. The rat. There's also a grounding problem with Singer. Singer makes it very clear we've got to give up this belief in God. We have got to give it up. We've got to accept, and he says this in Practical Ethics, we've got to accept that there's no ultimate meaning. We've got to accept there's no God to catch us. We just got to accept that, is what he says. But then he goes on to make, after saying this world has no ultimate meaning, to make a series of universal oughts and shoulds. We ought to respect animals. We ought to minimize their pain, maximize their pleasure, treat them humanely, grant certain ones of them rights. How does he account for these oughts in a world where human beings are cosmic accidents, where a universe came from nothing and was caused by nothing? Where do these oughts come from that he is so quick to throw out? Now, let me be clear about something. Can Singer the atheist recognize moral oughtness? Yeah, he can. That's written, by the way, in Scripture. Romans tells us that it's written in our hearts and our natures as human beings to recognize certain moral truths, even though in his case he's going to have a bear of a time grounding them. How's he going to ground these moral oughts? If we're all the products of accidental chance, I don't know where you get objective morality. If you get a chance to do it, Greg Koukl and Michael Shermer had a debate on Hugh Hewitt's show back in, 9 months ago. And Greg pounded Michael Shermer, the atheist, on his inability to ground human dignity and right and wrong. And Shermer struggled all over the map to say why certain things are wrong in themselves. He couldn't do it. And I think Singer has the same problem. But here's another issue. If we ought to grant animals a right to life, where does that right to life come from? If we ought to grant them the right to have dignity, where does it come from? Now, Singer's going to respond with a half answer. Well, humans have no more right than animals. That's going to be his answer. But that's not what we're really asking. Why does anything have value and a right to life? Is what I want to know him to answer. I want to know, how do we account for that in his system? And I don't see how we account for it in his system. He can recognize it, which is why he tells us we ought to be kind to animals. But if there is no God, the highest authority is not something transcendent, it's what? Government, right? So if a government revokes rights for animals, to what is Singer the atheist going to appeal? There's nothing to appeal to. We choose not to respect animals. Now what, Mr. Singer? You see, he can't ground his rights claims or his moral claims, and that's the big problem, I think, with Singer. He just doesn't have a way to ground these moral lots. All right. Any questions on that before we do our final thing and get out early?
I can't remember, that debate that Greg Hickel had with Michael Shermer. I can remember Michael Shermer trying to argue for objective moral values, but I can't remember how he was trying to do it.
He was saying that as a community, the question is, how did Michael Shermer try to argue for objective values? He says, well, basically, just go ask the women who've been mistreated, and they'll tell you that they feel wronged when they're mistreated by men. He was basically arguing for what amounts to emotivism, the belief that morality is just emotional expressions.
And since everybody has that, he
Yeah,
say that's...
yeah, and then he also tried to make this community argument that over the course of thousands of years of history, we've evolved into this sense that's objective now. And Greg just said, well, what if another community evolves to believe it's okay to kill Jews? Now what? And Greg really handled it well. It was outstanding. And you can get the CD of that from Stand to Reason.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.